The House meets this Saturday to respond to a situation of great gravity. We are here because, for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands. Margaret Thatcher, British Prime Minister, 1982. For many, the Falkland Islands represented an obscure British territory in the South Atlantic that held little economic value, let alone a place where one could easily identify on a map. But as the conflict between one of the world's aging empires and a military junta unfolded, the powers of the world took note at how modern warfare between fairly well-equipped naval and air forces lent themselves to managing a ground invasion. As the smaller wars of the late 20th and early 21st century began, many militaries and governments looked back to how the Thatcher government gained in national popularity from armed conflict, if not in economic or even strategic terms.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
A military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been unbelievable.
Na pełny rozgląd myśli захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. P.T. Carlo from Thermidor Mag, to talk about the Falklands War. So let me introduce him. Say hello, please.
Hey guys, I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you on for the first time. And I'm also joined by Hank.
Hi, everyone.
Alex.
Hello.
And last but not least, Hans.
Hey, guys.
So before we jump into the war, which officially started in 1982, I wanted to give you guys a quick overview of how the Falkland Islands became even a settlement. It's actually very far off the radar, literally and figuratively, in terms of just where people live in the world. It's almost at the edge of South America, almost up by Antarctica. It's a few hundred miles off of the coast of Argentina, and it's near the Cape Horn, where all those old sailing ships before the Panama Canal was built used to sail around to get from Europe to the western part of the Americas and vice versa. So the first discovery of the Falklands happened in 1690 by English Captain John Strong. After that, it was actually quite some time, about 74 years later, the French established Port Louis in East Falklands Island. 2 years after that, the English established Port Egmont in Saunders Island. So I should back up and say the Falklands are an archipelago, but I would say there's about 3 big islands. So this is another one of the islands. And then in the same year, 1766, the French concede Port Louis to the Spanish for whatever trade that was going back in Europe. You know, this is how empires conducted things back then. They would often move territories back and forth as part of negotiations. So that went to the Spanish, and it became Port Soledad. In 1770, Spain captures Port Egmont, if I'm saying that correctly. In 1771, there was a near war with Britain, but Spain gives back the territory to avert the war. Cutting to the the 19th century, 1806, Napoleonic Wars. Britain invades Rio de la Plata, and Spain abandons its garrison on the Falkland Islands, leaving the gauchos and fishermen remaining. The 1820, Buenos Aires attempts to assert control of the Falklands, and in 1832, the British reassert control after Argentinian garrison mutiny occurs. In 1840, the Falklands becomes an official crown colony of Britain, and Scottish settlers create a pastoral colony with cattle and sheep. In 1844, the government moves to Port Jackson, which then becomes Stanley, which is the current capital. And After that, in 1851, the wool industry, which obviously comes from sheep, surpasses shipwrecking, which is basically taking shipwrecks and salvaging what you can from them. So that's when wool becomes the main industry in the Falklands. In 1871, steamships surpass sailing ships, further cutting down on the sort of transshipment aspects of stopping along the way while you're sailing on your long journey in places like the Falklands. And in 1914, as I mentioned before, the Panama Canal opens and effectively ends all of the transshipment around the Cape Horn, so further cutting down traffic. So after that, essentially, the Falklands have become a strategic point, and it's actually the scene of a very pivotal battle in the First World War between Britain and England, which Britain knocks out a German ship. And then in World War II, the British then again try to put some military support on the islands with, in my opinion, a very silly fear that the Japanese are going to invade. But they do that anyway in the Falklands. And then in 1979 through, I would say, 1981, Britain actually considered transferring sovereignty of the islands to Argentina to save money. But negotiations don't go anywhere. And then
that was the 1981 Nationality Act, where they made Falkland Britain's second-class citizens. They had like limited voting rights, limited civil rights, and that's part of the reason why eventually the Argentine military thought they could just take the place over, because it appeared that the British didn't really care about those people anymore, and were kind of pulling a Rhodesia scenario.
Okay. And then, of course, in 1982, Argentina invades the islands.
And one of the interesting things about these islands is that I was curious if there's any real resources. And the only thing that stuck out to me was that there have been a lot of seismic studies done since the 50s on the islands to determine if there were offshore oil resources that could be used. And there are, but none of them were exploited until 1998. That was when you had exploratory wells dug. So they're never really been a big resource hub. They're just sort of in a key geographic position.
So if you're trying to get to why the Argentinians even bothered to invade, is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the islands has been marked by war since, at least the 17th century in a lot of ways. But I think that I was curious why it is exactly outside of national sovereignty that the Argentines would care. And I was curious if there had been a history of oil development, and there really hadn't until long after this dispute had been settled.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I don't think it was over oil or any real natural resources other than grazing land, to be frank. I think the real reason was the government was basically trying to wag the dog, and they were under a military dictatorship, and there was actually a very severe, that's a subjective term, but there were a few thousand people that were killed under the regime, and it was not a very popular government. And I think what the leaders were doing was they were basically trying to bolster national pride in doing something like this, and essentially, bolster its own political base. So I think that's the main reason.
Yes, I think it's important to remember, too, that the leaders of the military government in Argentina didn't think the British would actually go to war over this.
Right.
Assumed that, especially you have to remember what Britain was at the time. Margaret Thatcher had just taken power a couple years before. It was still very much on the downward, kind of like a downward economic spiral. Ironically, a couple days before they invaded, I believe they were actually going to sell off the HMS Invincible, which was one of the carriers they used during the war, to Australia. But that was canceled at the last minute. So basically, you have an empire on the decline, and even people in England didn't think that they were actually going to do it either. So that's another factor you need to take into account, that not only it wasn't really about oil, it was about taking the focus off of the problems in Argentina and spurring up nationalism, which it did temporarily, and also that nobody really thought anything would come of it, essentially.
Yeah, the Argentinians were citing, I guess, internally this, they called it like the Goa precedent, where the British had allowed the island of Goa to be taken over, and so that was why one of the reasons they thought the British would not be willing to fight for something that was so far away from their home island.
Well, post World War II, British foreign policy was essentially a policy of giving up. They gave up over time every single territory that they had, it seemed. So I'm sure for the Argentine government, it was like, I mean, these are the people who gave up India and Rhodesia, and yet they're about to. There's no way they're gonna launch a full-scale war over an island chain with a couple thousand people.
And yet they would continue to give up things even after this.
Right.
When they gave up Hong Kong in 97 or 98, whenever that was.
I mean, both, I think PT kind of touched on this, both Britain was sort of on the decline. Like the 70s for the British economy were a disaster. Like it was marked by these huge labor strikes, marked by like huge shortages. There were so many problems in the British economy, and the Argentine economy was not doing well either. One statistic was that in 81 and several years prior, you had inflation climbing into the triple digits year after year. In 81, it climbed to 600%. And manufacturing was down by double digits for the entire decade of the 70s and into the 80s for the Argentines. Both countries were sort of on the rapid decline, and they had these charismatic leaders trying to resuscitate them. So you had Margaret Thatcher, and then you had Leopoldo Galtieri, who was the current general running the junta, sort of as a stand-in president at the time.
I think that I wanted to just segue really quick into why the Falklands are significant and why it's interesting, apart from some of the more obvious things. Like, one of the things people don't even know is we call it the Falklands War, but war was never actually declared between the UK and Argentina. It was just a kind of like a military exercise, kind of like a police action almost. That, and also that, unlike most of the Cold War period, in which you had, Soviet-equipped forces facing off against Western-equipped forces, right? And that's usually kind of how things went down in the Arab world, in Asia, etc. This is kind of a weird situation because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, period. It also didn't make any sense in the context of the Cold War because Argentina and the UK were both essentially American allies equipped with American weapons, or at least Western weapons. Argentina was trained to fight by the United States. This is the big reason for me why it's interesting, is that it's really the only time that we have an example on a large scale of modern naval weapons being deployed. It's kind of like after the First World War, as a little anecdote, aerial bombardment had just been developed right at the end of World War I. And then within 10 years, it went from pretty primitive to relatively advanced. You have the 30s, you have relatively advanced bombers. But nobody had ever really seen them in action. So the generals on various sides came up with these really interesting ideas of what war would look like. And a lot of them thought that, these planes would just end warfare as we know it, because they couldn't anticipate lots of things. They couldn't anticipate anti-aircraft weapons. They couldn't anticipate anything. And so basically we're taking away here is that you don't really know how these weapons work until they're actually tested. And this is the only example we have of that, of any sort of modern naval equipment being tested. And that's why it's fascinating.
Right. So I think the first indication that there was going to be a military conflict was when there was this invasion, or I would say there was this kind of violation of the protocol, and then you could read it as an invasion or at least a scouting group on, I think it's called South Georgia Island, and it's actually very very distant from the Falklands, relatively speaking, compared to the other islands in the chain. And it was sort of just testing the waters, I think, from Argentinian perspectives, where they had essentially sent a group of either researchers or some other very kind of crudely covered group to visit the islands, but they didn't ask for permission. And when they were discovered, the British saw that the buildings had been defaced and vandalized, and then the Argentinian flag had been raised. And this was the first kind of act of aggression on the part of the Argentinians that the British started preparing against. And then from there, there was basically an escalation. And then what ended up happening was the British put this 200-mile exclusion zone where the airspace, or you can call it like a no-fly zone in today's parlance, but that was sort of the area in which the British would fire upon any Argentinian vessel coming into range around the islands. And then from there, the sort of dynamics of the war unfolded.
Just so people know, South Georgia is basically a frozen rock in the middle of the deep South Atlantic, which really doesn't have anything on it besides like a small research station, I think.
Yeah, they're basically like the Antarctic like researchers that are using it as kind of like a stopping point.
So I see that there are about 3,000 people living on the Falkland Islands. What are they up to? I mean, 3,000 people, that's not
farmers.
That's like
they're farmers and ranchers, basically.
And fishermen.
Yeah.
Not much is what they're up to.
I mean, there's probably some.
I admire the pastoral lifestyle.
Yeah. Do they take
they're open to tourists now. It's kind of becoming like an agro-tourism destination, something like that.
Huh.
Yeah, but don't step on a mine. There are currently 20,000 unexploded mines throughout the island, so pay attention where you're stepping.
Nice. I mean, I imagine there's probably some British scientific activity or academic activity, but there's not really much going on there, and I don't know how much the people there really contributed to Britain, although they certainly were not interested in becoming Argentine subjects. There was a poll done a few years ago on whether or not, like a referendum almost, on whether or not they wanted to remain British subjects, and well over 90% of Falklanders said that they wanted to remain British subjects.
Yeah, I believe that is the primary defense the British will make for retaining its control over the islands.
Right.
And it's recognized by, I think, most of the countries in the world.
So these are basically Scottish descended, like Highland cattle raisers?
Yes.
Those are the ones that did the sheep farming, and there
sheep.
There was originally they called it a feral cattle population, but the sort of yield of the land was more productive with sheep, and so that became the dominant industry for, at least in agriculture, and I think it is still the dominant industry in the island overall. And those were Scottish settlers originally who set that up, and then actually there are a few Germans and Scandinavians who also live there, and I'm sure there's British.
I bet they have good shepherd's pie there with all that sheep.
It's probably fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you make shepherd's pie from sheep? From lamb,
Yeah.
I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the proper way to make it.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention 3 days before the invasion, which is on April 2nd, there were mass labor demonstrations in front of the presidential, palace or administrative building, and across the country, and there were plans for more. And it was looking very...
In Argentina?
In Argentina. It was starting to look like there might be some kind of real left-wing instability in the country. Prior to this, we have really the Argentine cooperation and Operation Condor, and the cooperation with a lot of U.S. anti-communist efforts, and this is why it becomes uncomfortable for Reagan to deal with this, because the Argentine military had done a really good job of working with Pinochet, working with the Brazilians, working with later the Contras in El Salvador to take down communist efforts from the Soviet Union across Latin America. And at a certain point, I think that had started to boil over. And so they had already developed these invasion plans for a while. And then they launched them April 2nd and take over the island pretty easily. I don't know if anyone was killed.
No,
no,
there was
no
actually.
killed.
I think an Argentine was killed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there was something like 60 some on the island, and I think they had a brief firefight with the Argentine forces, and they were quickly overwhelmed and they surrendered. But I think a couple Argentines might have been killed. But basically, it was very little bloodshed. It was over very quickly. The Argentines rolled on shore with an amphibious landing. When you're thinking of kind of countries that we think of third world countries being able to mount things like that. Yeah, that was over, and it seemed like it was
second
kind of
world, if I'm not
mistaken.
mistaken.
They're not a third world country. That I don't know. In the 80s, they were the early 80s. They were certainly not that.
Argentina was among the richest countries in the world in like 1920, 1910. Right.
Yeah.
And they kind of just stayed at that level. They haven't had sustained economic growth above the level of like World War I, First World. I mean, they've had a bit, but that's one way to think about them. So they're like not too bad at this point. They're probably further behind the First World now than they were back then.
Yeah,
I'm just comparing them to their capabilities right now, which their military basically is almost non-existent right now. So just to think they were able to pull off some of the stuff they did is pretty remarkable in retrospect.
Yeah, that's a long. Do we know how many miles or kilometers it is to do the amphibious landing that they pulled off?
I would estimate it's about 500 miles, maybe a little bit more. Yeah,
that's not bad.
Check the map.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think those landing craft were actually going from Argentina to the islands. They were probably on a carrier ship. I could be totally wrong, but I would imagine
they were launched from ships.
Yeah.
Did they utilize?
Yeah, but they have the capacity to pull off an operation like that. If you're able to keep thousands of men at sea, that was
the initial assault. The actual deployment of troops was done by, I think, aircraft and helicopter over time. It wasn't all in once, like with D-Day or something.
What was the defensive force in place?
There was very little. I mean, the British didn't exactly expect this. Like that some big
like
country would take over some rock, in the South Atlantic.
Yeah, they're Marines, approximately Royal Marines that were there. Like that's the force. Like nobody saw this coming. Essentially, 60
Marines with FALs against several hundred or maybe a few thousand Argentinian, well-trained Marines.
Yeah, trained by the United States.
And Hank would know. Everyone was using FALs. I think it's important to establish that. If that's indeed true.
Definitely the Brits would have, and I think that's before they got their weird bullpup configuration thing. I think that was like the late 80s started using those. I don't know what the Argentines
I'm pretty sure both sides,
but I would assume FALs.
Yeah, I think both sides had some FALs in action.
Well, what was the decisive factor in the two militaries? I think I can claim the strength of the Argentinians, and the British I'm a little bit less clear, but we can kind of go into that. But you guys want to sound off on that?
Let's start with the actual events of the war really quick.
Yeah,
so in the beginning of April, it's taken over by the Argentines, right? Pretty simple, not a big complex affair. Then England has to put together a task force to go to the South Atlantic. And remember, as I was saying before, they had just decided to sell the HMS Invincible, which was one of only two carriers. And these aren't American-style carriers. These really only launch Harrier jump jets, which would be made famous by this war. And they were going to sell one of these to Australia a couple days before this happened, and that was canceled, obviously. Basically, they had to put together a huge task force they could really cobble together from the Navy and send it south. Also, an important point along this road that they set up was this an island called Ascension Island. It's one of the only usable rocks in the South Atlantic. Military station for quite a while, and this played a pretty important role in refueling
It's
warships
also operated by the United States, which is wanting to remain neutral at the beginning, and that was Reagan's position, and I believe it was Secretary of State Haig and National Security Advisor Weinberger that wanted to go onto the side of the British, and after that they basically lent support like that. They offered some training, I think, for one of their amphibious vehicle carriers in the case that the British lost one of theirs. So it wasn't immediate support, but it was sort of like a backup support that the United States ended up doing.
Yeah, I mean, they had to scrounge together the Hermes, which I think was 30 years old at that point. It was this ancient aircraft carrier that they were putting back out to sea, and it hadn't really been well repaired, and it was sort of non-functional. And they had a huge amount of British merchant ships that they sort of commandeered and supplied, and basically forced into helping them keep their naval efforts going. The whole thing, this whole task force that was assembled in late April, was sort of done haphazardly because Thatcher and the government were trying to get the military to move as quickly as possible, because I think Thatcher wanted to save face politically. And her military was pretty clear that if things went a certain way, the entire task force could be destroyed. Like, this was what they were sending was not capable of sustained bombardment from, I think, mostly air-launched, later Exocet missiles. And she just didn't really care. I think that she had several of her ministers resign over this affair throughout the couple months it went on. But she was pretty determined to have this sort of light task force with very old or very unequipped ships launch this war effort.
So let me butt in here and ask a question. The British Navy at this point is part of NATO, and it has responsibilities for policing like the Barents Sea, maybe the North Sea, maybe contesting the Baltic against the Soviets, and maybe policing the middle of the Atlantic. I don't know exactly, but certainly they're going to be involved in challenging the Soviet Navy. So are they allowed to pull ships out of that duty?
I'm sure the United States probably covered them. They probably didn't. If that was the case, I would think it would be smart not to advertise that, because they would probably want to see what the Soviet reaction would be. I don't know. I'm just sort of, that's what I would do.
Yeah, I don't think that the NATO vision of responsibility was sort of that defined on a day-to-day basis, that your entire military capability was committed to certain sectors.
Well, no, but I mean, if you're launching a pretty major operation so far, you're going to want to have a lot of slack. You're going to want to have as many extra ships involved in that as possible. And I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on how they would.
Yeah, I mean,
my question is basically, what's their material situation in like a few?
Real shitty. Like this is essentially, in the worst case, a one-way trip. This is kind of like we keep throwing around this word task force, but it's more of a raid almost. You put together this one packet and you send it out there, and ideally, when you get there, you're able to kind of destroy all immediate opposition. But if that goes at all poorly, you have no ability to fuel, you have no ability to get reinforcements. Theoretically, you could be attacked on your way there, or you could lose a couple of oilers, and you would be just completely stranded in the mid-Atlantic. So, in that kind of a situation, your military, if they're given this task, they're going to want to basically delay and send as much force as is possible all in one shot. And if you're contrasting that with the political desire to leave as quickly as possible, there's going to be a severe tension there.
Yes, and there actually was very much a lot of tension, even in the British government, because they were under, as you said, a lot of pressure to get this done. It was also extremely risky, sending a task force like this all the way south, potentially into the hornet's nest, and things could have went south pretty quickly, both literally and metaphorically in this case.
To kind of speak to what you're talking about, Alex, they had to actually commandeer the SS Canberra, which is a cruise liner. This is this is essentially a cruise liner for leisure, and this is how they transported the majority of their commander brigades in the Royal Marines to the islands. Is on the back of a corporate-owned cruise liner. Like the whole thing was done last minute. And maybe that speaks to some of what you're talking about, that they had pre-established concerns with their navy in other parts of the world. But I also think that an element of it is just that the British were at a very major low point in their armed forces capabilities.
Well, that's actually an explicit part even of U.S. defense planning. So it's common for almost every country with a sizable kind of a shipping or marine industry that the government will do things like supply financing for U.S. flagged merchant vessels with the explicit contingency that they form effectively a naval reserve that you can use for things like transport or transport of material. Same thing actually with airplanes. Almost every U.S. flagged air carrier is being able to be called up as part of the air reserve.
Yeah, I don't know if this actually came from the Falklands War, but at one point in my life, I was reading a book on fighter aircraft, and it was actually profiling the Harrier. And there was an image of one of the Harriers actually hidden within the deck between cargo containers on one of these shipping container vessels. And that may have been, one of the techniques they used to actually camouflage some of their forces, which I think is actually kind of clever. But certainly, though, there's always been a merchant marine contingent in the United States playing a pretty pivotal role in World War II with Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets and the British. And these days, with the exception of the Jones Act vessels, there's probably not a whole lot of U.S. flagged vessels anymore. There are oftentimes these kind of like obscure countries that give incentives to shipping lines to take their flag, and you'll see like maybe a Maersk vessel. I don't know if they do this, but something comparable like that have like some West African country with the flag for legal reasons. It's quite silly, but one would hope that if you're sort of still a little bit nationally oriented, which any proper military would be, you would try to get your government to lobby for maintaining some of the commercial fleet to be utilized in an event like this where they don't have enough supports.
The British were in a, you're saying, we're basically all saying that the British are at the low point in a trough, in like unlike a time series plot where a series goes up and down, they're at the bottom. And they're really like the victims, actually. The libertarians are correct in this case, I think, of unrealistic expectations of what the state can easily arrange to happen socially.
Right.
So they're at the very beginning of this Thatcher phase, but apparently I don't know the post-war history of England well enough to be too confident, but I would imagine the 1970s were an era of, if not budget cuts to the military, at least like not sufficient investment to keep it up to date and as effective as it would have been in the 60s and in the 50s when the British were trying to do things like the Suez operation.
Right.
Yeah, to this day, the British are still fighting over actually the budget, which from an American perspective is quite interesting, and maybe that's not a bad thing, frankly, because you actually don't get overextended, perhaps. But to this day, they are still debating about whether, and actually, I think Thatcher was actually debating this in her day about keeping the nuclear deterrent, because it takes a fair amount of money to maintain those submarines and the bombers and whatever else, I guess, land-based launching systems. And I think she actually thought that was one of actually the more cost-effective ways to maintain integrity of the whatever's left of the empire.
Well, this is the end stage of like right-wing liberalism, I guess. If Carlo, do you think it's fair to call Thatcher a right-wing liberal?
Of course it is. Of course
she's
it is.
a neoliberal in
Yeah,
some ways.
that's exactly what you call her. That's the right term. So, that's where you're looking at the budget and you're looking at the spreadsheets and crunching the numbers and running it through your utility function. And you're concluding that, the ability to defend ourselves against like mortal attack is not worth, X amount of pounds sterling.
Did they have Lotus really 123 in 1982? I don't know. Be interesting.
It's a contrast.
I didn't hear what you said, Adam.
Oh, I just said, did they have Lotus 123 in 1982?
Yeah, but it's less sophisticated, I guess, but it's still what she's representing is like the Milton Friedman school of economics and the Milton Friedman school, frankly, of like looking at the world. Not to like put too. Yeah, I like Milton Friedman. I don't want to rag on him too badly, but
it's really a contrast between sort of your ability for force projection and your kind of immediate punching weight. There's only maybe a half dozen countries in the world currently that have the ability to do an operation of this magnitude, maybe even less than that. The U.S., Russia, France, Britain, China, and all of this stuff that you need in order to get a large amount of people to a place to do a thing is incredibly expensive, and 99% of the time you're not using it. And all of those resources could be devoted to, a better radar warning system for your home country, or another tank brigade on the Rhine, if you're still fighting a Cold War. So the force projection capabilities, like aerial refueling or just fueling ships, aircraft carriers, long-range submarines, nuclear submarines, this is all stuff that you really have to want the ability to do something like defend, for instance, the far-flung colonial empire before it's at all worthwhile. Otherwise, it would be completely insane for the kind of symmetric situation for the Argentine to invest in the ability to decide to hit the United Kingdom on a whip.
Going back to what Alex said really quick, just to respond, I think it's a little unfair to just caricature Thatcher as this sort of like soulless neoliberal who makes decisions based on spreadsheets. I mean, to an extent, that's true for sure. But I mean, even this decision to go to war is a sign that she's not just that. Like
her poll tax, famously, that's the reason people would judge her that way.
Obviously, in some ways, like I said, that's true. But even this decision to go to war like this, a pretty risky war, shows that she was a kind of nationalist in a lot of ways, even maybe a romantic. I think maybe around the time of once the task force finally got there, I think Reagan called her up and wanted her to and basically sign an armistice because they wanted the Argentines to be able to save face. They didn't want basically for one of their allies to be defeated and possibly destabilize their government. And she said no. She said that they had lost too many ships for it to be worth anything other than total victory. And that's, I mean, say what you want about her, but that's kind of a very admirable, even if romantic nationalist take on the whole thing.
Well, she was a hawk. I mean, they called her the Iron Lady, I believe, and I think during this time there's a lot of very memorable speeches you could probably find of her in Parliament, kind of talking about the importance of rallying the nation around this cause. So I think it's very fair to say that she's a bit of a nationalist in that sense.
No, it gets at my heartstrings a little bit. I mean, I identify with England in a lot of ways, and like, yeah, you're talking about we're not going to take any crap from some 2-bit junta in Argentina trying to take our sheep islands away from us. We're gonna launch like $1 billion. I don't know how much it costs to launch all the diesel fuel they use to get down there and all the ammo and everything. But we're gonna launch an expensive expedition and kick you bastards out. No, there's something to be said for that, for sure.
And it's just on a cold political calculus, it seems like a good investment because you're not engaging a superpower and your conflict zone is over a very minor area. And so the cost escalation potential is pretty low. And so
there's no risk of getting nuked.
It's a good idea.
But one of my questions that I have here written down was that, quote, was this Zog breaking down, England acting on her own, in question mark. So I guess that this answers that question. This was a bit of an intra-U.S. empire, sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, dispute. One U.S. vassal. The vassal war, yeah. So the Duke
Crusader
of Argentina and the Duke of England are going to war.
Exactly.
So if we want to get back to when the shit really starts to hit the fan in this conflict, basically after the task force gets there on April 30th, the next day they start attacking Argentine positions on the Port Stanley airfield. And immediately the Argentine Air Force engages the British head on, which was sort of, I think, surprising to a lot of the British Air Force. They had not expected actual air-to-air encounters with the Argentines. There's a BBC documentary made a couple years after the fact, and there's interviews with several sailors and pilots. And they were stunned that they were finding like real head-on resistance from the Argentine military.
Yeah, I actually want to talk.
Surprising. Like you can't mount a invasion, claim to seize the Maldives for the glory of Argentina, and then not, as a Air Force general, engage the colonial power coming to take back their shit. Like,
I have no idea.
I think it was surprising just because people. I think it's important to remember that people still couldn't even fathom, especially in England, that war was actually going to happen. I think a lot of people thought it was going to be a kind of gumboat diplomacy where they go down there and maybe like drop a couple bombs and then the Argentines will hand it over, sort of thing. It was just hard for them to fathom that this would actually turn into a real war. And speaking of, I do want to talk about this really quick, since we're on this topic now, of the Argentine Air Force. Now, the Argentine Air Force was relatively decent. It had a bunch of interesting planes. But one of the disadvantages I think a lot of people don't realize they had was that the Falklands didn't have airstrips long enough, modern fighters. So basically, most of the Argentine Air Force was not able to take off from the Falklands. So they had no close air support. They had no air patrols. They had nothing like that. All their forces had to be launched from the mainland, which is hundreds of miles away, so that by the time they got to the Falklands area, they basically had enough fuel for maybe one run at the ships. And then they had to go back. So this is one of the big disadvantages the Argentine Air Force had, and in retrospect, it makes what they were able to accomplish that much more interesting and impressive.
I agree. I actually think they did well considering the sort of forces they were dealt. I mean, if you were sort of not examining this very closely and you just compared the numbers of aircraft on the British side and the Argentinian side, you would probably, assuming that they're roughly competently trained pilots, and that may be a bad assumption, but let's just, for argument's sake, let's just say that, so that they're equally capable pilots and the aircraft are roughly comparable as well. The Argentinians had a 2-to-1 advantage roughly, and that is actually not sufficient to understand why they were struggling, because as Carlo just mentioned, the distance in which they had to fly from really limited their time in combat. And so effectively you're cutting down your Air Force to however long they can be in the air. And so even though the British had fewer aircraft, they can get them up in the air much more often because they had the carriers. So right. they were much more well positioned.
And the Argentines had a bunch of French aircraft, isn't that right, Carl? They had the Mirage and several other. I think they were French manufactured, and then the French trained them in how to use these aircraft.
Story. We're going to maybe get ahead of ourselves here, but that's fine. Their big aircraft was the Mirage, which they didn't really use that much except for as a kind of reconnaissance or as a decoy after an initial engagement, which we'll talk about later. They had, and their other two big planes were the Super Entendard, right? Which was the one that famously launched the Exocets. And the other one, which was, in my opinion, the most badass plane of the entire war, was the A4 Skyhawk. It's really underrated.
Is that the Douglas jet the Americans used in the Navy in Vietnam?
It's the American Navy jet from the 50s. It's ugly as hell, but it actually did really good for the Argentines. It actually sunk most of the ships that were sunk by Skyhawks, not by the Exocet. People don't understand that.
Well, they sunk ships? How many ships are they sinking?
Well, the Exocets sunk at least 4. I'm not sure.
Wow.
Here's the deal with the Exocets. It gets a lot of press, but the truth is that a lot of ships had them, but the Argentines had just received them. They only had 5 operational Super Entendards, and they also only had 5 operational missiles for them that were Exocets. Okay, at the outset of this war, they only had 5 of them, and they also weren't trained at the beginning of the war in how to use them. They just arrived, so they had to quickly learn how to use them while the task force was on its way south. And out of those 5 missiles, they had, I think, 3 hits, two sunk ships with 5 missiles, which is pretty damn good, opinion. But so really, the Exocet wasn't that big. It was a psychological threat, but they didn't really have enough of them for them to be able to stop the British in this. And people don't know that. It's actually an interesting fact about this whole thing.
Yeah, 2 of the ships that got taken out by Exocets, I think, were merchant marine vessels. They were merchant vessels. But yet, like the Exocet missile is. I was trying to figure out this last night if it was supersonic or not. It is about 50 mph below supersonic speed. Is my understanding.
Well, why is it so lethal? I mean, does it have some sort of homing device where it can pick up a vessel on sort of like low radar? Basically, it's like flying close to the ocean.
Yes, it flies very close to the waves, effectively, and it's going at 0.92 Mach, so it's almost Mach 1, which is supersonic.
In modern ships, there is relatively little armor, so when you have mostly because it adds weight, reduces speed, it reduces fuel efficiency, reduces operating range. So if you have a very close to the waterline missile, you have the ability to, after you account for the explosion and the listing of the ship and the motion of the waves, have a below the waterline hit with extremely high probability, which is to say your ship is at the very least disabled, probably is sunk.
Yeah, and
I'd like to read off some casualty statistics just very quickly. I think that this could give people an idea of the scale of the war. Would that be okay? Just put them in here now.
Sure.
Hello? Yeah. There's 255 killed on the British side, 650 killed on the Argentinian side. And then there's, a few hundred POWs on the British side, 11,000 POWs on the Argentinian side. 2 destroyers on the British side, and 2 frigates, 1 cruiser, 1 submarine on the Argentinian side, and then 25 helicopters and 35 fighters for the Argentinians, and 24 helicopters and 10 fighters for the British. So it's a little bit of context as to the magnitude of the conflict, even if that may have been brutal to endure.
Sure, and let's talk about those casualties on the Argentinian side, and that 1 cruiser that was lost. And it started at the very beginning of the war, and then we can get back to the Exocets a little later. But the General Belgrano is one of the more famous instances of the war, in which a British submarine sunk a Argentine cruiser, which was actually originally an American World War II era complement of like 700 guys on it. It sunk and a lot of those, like I think 300 or 400 guys died on that. So about maybe even more than half of the casualties, at least of the killed in actions, were from this one instance where a British submarine sunk one of their World War II era cruisers. When this had a huge effect on the Argentinians. Like, it's important to remember that most of this war was between the Argentine Air Force and the British Navy. But the Argentines had a pretty impressive navy themselves. After the Belgrano sank, they were forced, or they weren't forced, but they made a decision to actually go north back to port because they were too afraid of having one of their other ships sunk. And one of a really interesting was that another thing people don't know is that the Argentines had their own aircraft carrier, which had Skyhawks on it. So in a way, it was even more kind of advanced than the British one. It was able to fly off of it. And on May 1st, actually, it had detected the British fleet. So this, and I think it was the day
Sorry,
before.
did you say fixed-wing aircraft off of it? I think you broke up when you were talking about their fixed-wing. Okay, so fighters and attack fighters.
The A4, which is, I guess, an attack vessel, it's kind of a ground attack one. It was used in Vietnam. This is what John McCain actually flew and I guess crashed and then got captured. But this is the American-built Douglas A4.
Yeah, which is, as I said, a really fascinating aircraft and also extremely ugly.
I like it personally, so, to each his own.
Yeah, so back to this little anecdote. The Argentine carrier, which the name was, I'm not even kidding here, it's pretty, I find it was funny. Something like Cinco de Mayo. I'm literally not even kidding. No, it's the 25 de Mayo. Literally, it's
the 20.
Believe it or not, it was ironically originally a British carrier from World War II, which had been sold to the Dutch and then been sold to the Argentines. It was of the islands the day before the Belgrano was sunk. And it had actually detected with one of its AWACS aircraft, it had detected the British task force and was actually about to launch. But because of strong winds, they aborted it. And then the next day, because of the Belgrano, they were forced to go back. So basically, this war almost saw the first action between carriers since the Second World War. And it almost happened if the winds had been a little less. We might have actually seen it, and who knows what would have happened.
So do you want to talk about the HMS Sheffield, which goes down 2 days later with the infamous Exocet strike?
That's the first Exocet, and that's kind of the Argentines' response to the Belgrano getting it.
Yeah.
What's interesting about it is it gets nailed by, it's a Type 42 destroyer, which didn't really have any defenses against an Exocet, because it basically had something called a Sea Dart defense, which is for medium flying aircraft, which I think we'll come back to later. But it didn't have anything against an Exocet. And so they hit it with an Exocet launched from a Super Entendard. From all the Exocet launches loaded that we know of. So this missile it exploded. It basically just went through and it caused fires just based on the kinetic energy of it.
Well, it hit the engine room. It actually breached the main engine hull of the ship, and that's when it kind of something exploded. Like, you can see there's a small explosion, but the warhead itself didn't explode. Although, yeah, you're right. There's fires and people are getting burned up or getting thrown around.
People died.
Yeah.
And then they had to abandon the ship, and it sunk a few days later just because of the damage.
Right.
But that was a huge psychological, impact on people, because these are supposed to be modern Western destroyers that are, invincible. It's the height of naval technology, et cetera, et cetera. And this, I think at the time, Sheffield cost like something like $1982, and the Exocet cost like $250,000. So that's kind of, the reality that they're facing now.
How much did the Sheffield cost?
$50,1982. So I don't know what that would be now, but
wow. That's a bad cost ratio.
You see this sort of asymmetry there because the cost of attack is disproportionately lower than the cost of defense with a vessel like this, and the sort of force projection of a vessel that is on the bottom of the ocean is effectively zero. So, if you're just a nation that is looking to defend its regional territory, you might as well just invest in anti-ship missiles, which is what China does, which is smart. It's just much more economical, and you can have
the new anti-ship missiles are so fast, and I think they're so affordable that you can put conceivably they can put a swarm of them up, and really deter any naval incursion for quite a distance from the shore.
Yeah, I was talking about this with Carlo actually last night in preparation for this, and him and I basically came to the conclusion that D-Day style landings will probably never happen again in our lifetimes, barring huge changes because of how far along anti-ship missiles have come. That any major ship that gets even close enough to your shoreline to launch an mass amphibious landing is just going to get nailed repeatedly.
So did the British have, maybe this is getting ahead of ourselves here, but did the British have a garrison there today that's formidable?
Oh yeah, it's absurd actually. I think it's 5,000 men, an advanced destroyer.
Okay, good.
Jesus Christ.
6 fighter craft.
You have an entire brigade there defending the Falklands against any trickery.
Argentines today don't even have an air force, literally.
Oh man.
They lost
the city of London. The city of London has given off a lot of taxes for a lot of years, so they have some money to maintain. The British really have quite a formidable military, actually.
Yeah. Nowadays they do. Now, I mean, I think in the 90s they started to re-implement a lot of their military as the French sort of wound down, and the United States needed a partner in NATO that could actually fulfill on real obligations.
And the Germans have almost disarmed themselves. I think they have under 200,000 men, and they've emasculated all their various units that have long histories. They've made them remove their old crests and things.
I was looking at the sort of fighter squadron force numbers of Europe just today randomly, and there was a map showing France has the highest number of fighter jets. It's around 250, and Germany has under 100. Actually, Poland has more. So, yeah, certainly.
How many does Russia have? They probably have
800 or something like that. I can't remember, but yeah, that was
a lot of them would be outdated. But
so back to the war, guys.
Yeah.
Back to the war. We can talk about it is all relevant, but I think the best part of the war is coming up, guys. But so you have this exocet strike. Real action starts. And I don't think the landings take place until later that month, but you do have a lot of naval action and a lot of air action. And so you have these, luckily, as I said, people don't realize that the Argentines only really had 5 missiles. And one of the hits they got with the exocet missile, they had taken off of an Argentine destroyer, which was an anti-ship missile, up on the Falklands Island, a kind of a makeshift rig up, and they actually got a hit on a ship they had set up on shore. That was the other exocet hit. So the exocet doing pretty good against the British Navy for having 6 launches and 3 or 4 hits and 2 sinkages. But the interesting part of all this is, again, the A4s, and what they were able to do is, it's hard to believe that they were able to do this, but a lot of the ships that were sunk, basically everything else that was sunk, the exocet sunk the Sheffield and damaged it, and it sunk a cargo vessel, copters, and a bunch of pretty important stuff. But the rest of the ships were all sunk and damaged by mostly A4s. And what they did is they would fly in super low at incredibly high speeds and literally drop their bombs from a few hundred feet in the air right onto the ships. Basically something out of World War II. They were able to do this somehow. which is like balls of steel stuff, and that's how they're able to defeat a lot of their aircraft systems.
On May 19th, you have the servicemen who die when, or the SAS guys who die when the helicopter goes down. Do you know more about that, Carlo?
Day now we're talking about you said on the 19th, on May 19th?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about the Bluff Cove air attacks?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know much about this incident, but there's a helicopter full of SAS guys that they have to ditch in the sea for some reason, and 22 of them die.
This one with this story probably escaped my research gaze. There's a bunch of pretty interesting SAS activity during this war, obviously.
Yeah.
They actually
This is right before they actually start their landings and they start getting on San Carlos with ground troops.
In the month. I'm not familiar with that one, but I know there was a lot of interesting SAS activity. I think they even landed some troops on Argentina proper in a secret mission to kind of take out the exocet stores they thought existed.
Well, there was also a landing in Chile, and I think they ended up going to Argentina, but it never amounted to anything.
They got chased off, and they ended up having to like hitchhike back to like the British embassy or something.
There was an important role that the British SAS played in this conflict. I remember watching a documentary where that was demonstrated. I can't give you any more details, but I think they were important.
Let's get to the role of the Sea Harriers in all this, because they're another kind of iconic. I think they're the most iconic vehicle from this whole episode. Like it basically made these.
Does that pass your aesthetics?
These planes famous?
Does that meet your
for
standard?
the A4? Like I said, A4 is much better aesthetically for me. But
oh, you like it now, or it's
Cool
better than the A4? Yeah. What's your
A4
favorite
is like the
aircraft?
work-
I want to know.
You said it was ugly earlier.
Yeah.
Oh no!
Ugly in a good way, like an A10 ugly, or ugly in a bad way?
A10s are cool.
Like
yeah,
it just
Warthog
looks
ugly.
like chubby.
The only aircraft I find unattractive are the World War II Navy fighters. I think those are horrible looking. But the B-52 Mustang,
the huge engine.
The what is it? The F-52. What is the first designation of the Mustang? That's a great looking jet. Or it's not even a jet, but it's a propeller.
58.
P-52. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I'm kind of partial to the F4. No, but it's just another
I like
one
it
of those.
too. A lot of people don't, but I agree with you. Yeah.
I think the modern ones are the worst looking, like the F-16 and the F-15. Those
F-16 is pretty attractive, I think. Like
think so?
I think the 22 sucks.
I think the MiG-29 looks pretty cool.
All right, so good. So we've got the rankings now.
So the Sea Harriers, what do you want to talk about those,
Like,
Carl?
so they have a couple of advantages, but again, they're also kind of misunderstood, like the Exocet. Basically, one of the main advantages, which I think you talked about earlier, was their famous vertical takeoff and landing ability, which meant that basically there were two different kinds. There was the Sea Harrier, and there was the kind of the normal Harrier, which was kind of designed to take off from like runways in Eastern Europe or in Germany. And so basically one of the great things about the Harrier was that they were able to literally just land anywhere, right? So they were actually able to take all their Harriers south with them, including ones that weren't even designed to take off from, just land them on the carrier and then just, move out. Like there were pilots that had literally never flown off a carrier before, just because it was so simple. And also they were also during the war on the tops of cargo vessels when they ran out of fuel. Things like that that made them, and also like they were able to outmaneuver barrages and things like that sometimes during the war because they're able to change direction so quickly. So that was one of the more commonly known pros of the aircraft, was just their durability and their ability to adapt to different situations, right? But I think the big was that they were kind of some sort of super fighter. Although they did do well in that they racked up a pretty impressive kill count. The thing, again, people forget is that I think on the first or second day of the task force was actually there, they had a minor engagement with the Mirages. And I don't think that any Mirage was actually lost to, but that they disengaged for various reasons because they basically didn't want to come down and face the Harriers on their own altitude, essentially. So they ended up disengaging, but they didn't do super well. So basically the Argentines for the rest of the war decided to keep them as decoys, that they would send them out as decoys on missions to cover for other planes, but never really engage them. So basically all the planes the Sea Harriers were engaging were ones that were coming from the mainland and were going for runs either against British troops who had landed or against ships. And so they were running out of fuel, and they had no fuel to use to really engage combat. So they basically were just trying to get past them. And so it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel for the Sea Harriers. They were able to just, go off and hit them as they were coming in without any real air protection. Of that, they still, did really well. And without them, the invasion probably wouldn't have been able to happen.
The reputation that they have is that they kind of suck as kind of objective fighters. It's mostly if you absolutely that kind of short takeoff or vertical takeoff, and then vertical landing, depending on which version you have capability. Then at the time, until the F-35, I guess, is theoretically available now, that was the only aircraft that had that capability.
Yeah, if
you weren't prioritizing that, there'd be no reason that you would want that. They're mechanically finicky, they're slow, they have short range.
You're
I don't think their
optimizing.
electronics are particularly sophisticated.
You're optimizing in like two different sort of directions. You're trying to have this vertical takeoff component, which is probably pretty expensive in terms of weight and dedicated hardware. And then you're also trying to have a fighter. So it's never going to be able to do as well as a fighter that doesn't have that vertical takeoff constraint.
Well, that's the argument that Pierre Sprey, who designed the A-10 and the F-16, makes about the problems with the F-35. They've essentially over-designed it. It's sort of like you had this big meeting and all the armed services in the United States got together, and they basically just created long lists that they submitted to the government or the Joint Chiefs, and they had to reconcile that with Lockheed. And Lockheed is basically loving it because they're effectively getting $1 trillion at this point for putting in to what would normally be in 3 separate aircraft, 1 aircraft, and the thing is so complicated that it really doesn't function very well in any of the applications. And so they ended up creating 3 versions. There's an A, B, and C version of this F-35. And I think Pierre Sprey calls it like a fat turkey, that it can't turn, it's too slow, it doesn't have enough gas, and it's horrible at close air support. So it really is a failure in almost all levels. And the whole stealth advantage is something he doesn't believe in either. But the jump jet aspect is something that the Marines wanted, and the Marines do, or at least did, have the Harriers as well, but I can't think of any engagement short of maybe Lebanon or something where they might have used them. There's no footage I can think of that I've ever seen a Harrier being used. So it's a little bit of an odd request.
We should say that, at one point in history, in 1982, I guess, they were well received. Is that fair to say? So it's not like I had heard that the Marines' insistence on having vertical takeoff for their stumpy little carriers that they have. They still operate Harriers on these tiny carriers that they have, diesel carriers, I think. I'd heard that was just some unreasonable requirement that they have, but maybe it actually positions them well. Like if they have to do a Falklands operation and their guys are going to get potentially bombarded by, it's hard to imagine anyone having an air force, but
yeah, it's the absolute perfect thing if you're going to do some expeditionary force to the middle of nowhere where they have maybe an obsolete air force, maybe no credible air force. Like if you want air superiority over Ghana,
Yeah.
Like this is fantastic because, you know, if you have a breakdown, they're much easier to land. You can improvise some airfields. You can take an airfield and get them on and off there very easily. You know, they're perfect for that. Not so much for you know, fighting the Warsaw Pact or whatever. But that's not really what they're designed for either.
So maybe it's actually not such a bad piece of hardware. I had heard only bad things about it, and I was told that you could accomplish what the Harrier's doing with helicopters, but
I think the only reason
quite.
they were advantageous in this encounter was the British didn't really have a very large carrier fleet, and they were up against an air force that really couldn't loiter and present itself with really advanced fighter aircraft. If it was up against something that was Russian built with, you know, land strips that were nearby or aircraft carriers, I think they would probably get blown out of the sky. It's really just if you're up against sort of an inferior air force and you can't really muster all the landing facilities that you need, I think that's when it becomes valuable. And I don't know how many scenarios there are where a military has to go up against that. It's kind of a particular scenario that, you know, each military and government probably needs to evaluate if it's a priority or not.
Yeah, I think that all in all, it did pretty well. It was also able to do bombing missions as well. It's important to remember. And speaking of the Sea Harrier and the carrier fleet, another little anecdote here that I have dug up is, and speaking of how vulnerable this task force really was, besides being hit constantly by exocets and A4s, which drop bombs literally on them World War II style, which is remarkable to think about. But that the carrier task force was very afraid of exocets. It was very afraid of the Argentine Air Force, and so what they did is they positioned themselves to as far east of the Falklands, because like there's the Falklands, there's Argentina to the west, and then to the east is all open ocean essentially, right? As far east as they could, provide air support to where they needed to places they needed to bomb, and places they needed air support for, to basically be as far away from the Argentine Air Force as possible. And I said before that most of the Argentine Navy was recalled back to port after the Belgrano was sunk. However, there was one exception to that. There was a submarine which was tasked with following the task force, and it did that, an Argentine submarine. And it actually, this is another one of those weird coincidences of history, it actually got within striking distance of the HMS Hermes, and it was going to fire on it with a torpedo, and it was almost, so basically the HMS Hermes was only sunk, and the only reason it wasn't was because the submarine in question had a malfunctioning fire control system which had been misinstalled, which they only found out once they tried to fire the torpedo. So that's another, counterfactual what if, the HMS Hermes had been by this rogue Argentine submarine. And it also shows you just how vulnerable a lot of these surface vessels are to not only missiles and aircraft, but also submarines.
And how things pop up when you actually have to fight a war, rather than just kind of hypothesize what might happen in a war.
Not sure what you mean. In terms of like planning for things and where things don't go as according to plan?
Well, you have this, what's the HMS Hermes? What kind of ship is that again?
It's an aircraft carrier. It's a small, Harrier carrier, essentially.
Okay, so it's an extremely valuable piece of hardware, and some cheap old submarine is getting within shooting distance of it. Why is that? Why are they able to get so close? You would think that you'd have countermeasures in place so that an old submarine could not threaten your Harrier carrier.
Well, not every Navy is the U.S. Navy with all these ginormous
Not every
fleets.
Navy is the British Navy, though. I mean, they have sophisticated hardware in the British Navy.
I don't know. You got to take a look at some of the pictures of these ships. I remember watching a documentary of the triumphant return of one of these. I think it was the aircraft carrier, and it sailed into one of the harbors. It may have been London even, and the thing was just covered in rust. I mean, they weren't doing too well from what I could tell. Compared to the Argentinians, it was probably better, but I'm just saying it's not the U.S.
These things
Navy.
are supposed to be surrounded by destroyers and smaller ships, you know?
They weren't really well surrounded. Like, again, this task force was put together so haphazardly and so quickly that it didn't really follow conventional British naval parameters. This is something that probably needed to have been put together over the course of 4 or 5 months, not 20 days.
Which
That's
is to
something
say
that
that
really
they were
hurts you
caught
in
with Sorry, go ahead.
it really hurts you in the kind of tight systems integration that if you're going to have a bunch of specialized ships all interacting as part of a coherent unit. Like you're talking about anti-submarine capabilities there, which there are some ships that specialize that. There are some specialized units on a variety of ships, and they all need to be coordinating through whatever your sort of flagship is. And if these people have no experience in working with each other, or you don't have the kind of precise mix of stuff or the correct layout of stuff, it's not going to be very effective.
Interesting.
Yeah, also, I think the sonars on the British fleet were not actually that good, and that's why the Argentines were able to basically evade them. Yes, it goes back to basically they were not prepared for this at all.
Do you know?
Were the Argentines using diesel subs, or what? What were their submarine capabilities?
I think they were diesel subs.
Huh.
The French, the British, the Americans, the Russians, I think might be it. There might be one more that use nuclear, maybe the Indians, but the Chinese use diesel.
They weren't using nuclear.
The British? I mean, yeah, I think they are. Is that what you're saying?
The Argentines were almost certainly using diesel.
Yeah.
They obviously weren't using nuclear, so,
Right. Although I think they may have actually attempted to build a reactor in Argentina at one point, but they may have scrapped that. That could have been under Perón or later, but that was an attempt. And I don't think they fully developed that capability. So, if that's just civilian power usage, that's not even what you would probably need to do for a military vessel, which you have to have miniaturization and very highly trained technicians to make sure that those sailors can get out of there if there's a problem.
One of the worst, outside of the Sheffield getting hit, one of the worst incidents was the HMS Ardent and also the HMS Antelope, which were both sunk 3 days apart from each other. The Ardent was hit by not by an exocet, it was hit by some kind of bomb, right, PT?
Yeah, probably a Skyhawk, although it could have been one of their other bombers. It was probably a Skyhawk.
Yeah, the Antelope was hit by general bombs, or not general bombs, but bombs that had been dropped onto the hull of the ship, and they actually remained unexploded for several hours, and there were these attempts to defuse the bombs on the that had landed on the ship, and they failed, and they actually ended up setting one of them off, which put fires in the engine rooms, and then eventually hit the munitions batteries on the ship, and it exploded in the middle of the night. That was one of the more weird incidents because they had this crack team of bomb defusal experts who essentially ruined the ship and sunk it with attempts at, I think they had made 3 or 4 attempts at disarming them, and then eventually they had no real idea what they were doing, and the guys who tried to disarm them died. I think the main guy who was there died, and the other one I think died later in the hospital from wounds.
What caused the wounds? Did it actually explode, or
it actually exploded? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Having a bad day at the office. Shit.
Yeah, you got to clip the green wire, not the red one.
Yeah. Actually, another bad incident. The Antelope, all the destroyers getting hit by various things is one of the. But before I get to that, I actually want to talk about the Antelope really quick. Something just came to my mind. Is that the funny thing is a lot of those bombs dropped by the Skyhawks didn't even explode. This is another
Right.
strange counterfactual: is what would happen if they exploded? And that's another reason why the casualties really weren't that bad, was because a lot of the bombs just dropped on them and caused massive damage just from the kinetic energy, but they didn't explode. And one of the reasons was that the Argentines knew that the radar, because they actually had the same thing, they actually had, it's called a sea dart system, only really could shoot down things that were flying at a certain altitude. So that's why they came in super fast, hugging literally 100 feet off the deck, right? And they were able to evade them that way. But the problem is when you drop bombs from 100 or 200 feet above a ship, is that you can get caught in the blast of your own bombs. So what they did is they changed the timers on them to basically be delayed. But what this did was that it caused it so that they weren't really reliable to go off. Story. And that's why, I think we had 12 or 13 hits that didn't explode. Argentines had changed that. Who knows what would have happened. But going back to another, which is similar to this, it's called the Bluff Cove air attacks. It was on June 1st when they were landings on the Falklands, an actual amphibious landing. And they got attacked by a group of my favorite aircraft. Yeah, the Skyhawks attacked them. And they nailed one of these landing that had Marines on it, and they ended up killing 56 of them and wounding like 150 British Marines and sinking the ship.
Yeah, he had the RFA Sir Galahad and then the RFA Sir Tristram of Fitzroy. Sir Tristram, yeah. Yeah, those were the landing craft. Yeah, like those guys, I remember when I was researching this, apparently some of the people that they had in these amphibious landings were not actually trained in amphibious landings. They had at one point paratroopers taking part in amphibious landings, and they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't understand some of the orders being issued. They didn't understand the tactics of actually how to get up a muddy beach. So these guys were not in proper formation and were just sort of scrambling to find their units. It was not done very well at all. Like the British did not take this seriously, and this is definitely indicative of that.
Oh yeah, it was a complete clusterfuck essentially. Like the whole landing, like it was amazing. Like if the Argentines had, I think that they put all their ground forces on around Stanley and around another area which was kind of far from the actual landing. Mm-hmm. The British landed mostly unopposed, and if that hadn't have been the case, it could have been a really bad day for the British, because, as you were saying, like they were literally just they were almost defeated by the mud, no less, if they had to face a real enemy that day.
Yeah, I mean, if the Argentine military had not been so afraid of a Chilean advance and an attack on, I guess, the Beagle Islands or the Beagle Island, they likely could have stationed more of their elite troops on the Falklands themselves, and could very well have undone any British attempts at landing on the island.
Honestly, baffled by a lot of their decisions, especially because it seemed like there really weren't that many Argentinian troops, relatively speaking, on the island.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it didn't seem like they were really ready to go all the way. Which, I mean, it's easy for me to sit in my armchair and tell them to go all the way. Have more people die. It's not a big deal.
I believe a lot of them were conscripts, and again, it was coming from a time when the Argentinian government was not exactly very popular. And it's one thing to actually just be sitting back, in your villa in Argentina watching the television about, the victorious Exocet missile attack on the Sheffield or whatever ship it was. But it's another thing to actually be thrown into these foggy islands and be shot at with artillery and Harriers. And if these guys are not exactly loving their government, they're probably not willing to fight to the end, and they probably surrendered. I think the British captured over 11,000 Argentinian soldiers. So I don't know. I think morale probably played a big role in that.
There's also a problem with military governments and military government-dominated militaries, I guess, where they don't often select for competence in their kind of junior officers, because there's always the danger that they themselves are going to be placed. So you end up with a lot of junior officers that are selected for their political acumen or for being very loyal, rather than their ability to do things like defeating amphibious landings.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like their Air Force was relatively competent.
That's often the case. Yeah.
The Army, it seemed like didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, that's you see this pattern all over the place, because an Air Force is much smaller and it requires a kind of you must be this tall to drive dynamic. That tends to be where you see. It's also a lot more fun to fly a fighter jet than get down in the mud and drive a tank around. So you'll see in a lot of developing nation militaries that actually have air forces, the Air Force tends to attract a lot of talent, and they tend to kind of try at least to sharpen their skills internally, whereas Army tends to be much more politically sensitive, because armies can very easily stage coup because they have a lot of people. So you want to make sure that it's not incredibly effective all the way down, but that it's very much kind of a known quantity.
Unless you are Prussia.
Right. Well, Prussia didn't really have an air force as a thing in there. They weren't really a military government. They were a monarchy that had a very competent military attached to it.
So basically, once the British get on shore, though, after this Bluff Cove incident, it's sort of over for the Argentine effort at that point. They had two options: slowly wind down or commit all the way. And they decided not to commit all the way. And it's not really clear why exactly that was done, because at no point was there any real risk of like an American invasion of Argentina. There wasn't any real risk of anyone stepping in. And from what we know going on in the background, Argentina had a ton of support from Brazil, and it had support from other Latin American countries. And all they had to worry about was what Pinochet was going to do. So it's not really known why exactly, after they sank multiple ships and they were willing to get into ground battles with British paratroopers and commandos, why they just sort of stopped trying to reinforce the island.
Yeah, because I can give one hypothesis. It's the same internal regime dynamics of, okay, so we did okay, we lost, and now we can double down and risk a catastrophe. And in the context of a military government, if you have a military catastrophe, you're just begging to be replaced.
Yep.
Sure. I mean, I guess that makes sense. But I mean, in one way, isn't like any defeat kind of a catastrophe? Wouldn't it have been better to like double down and like try and beat them? Which, I mean, if you beat them, then it's like you're a hero. I mean, you beat a great imperialist power. You knocked them off. Like even the leftists have to love you.
If it's possible. But I don't know. Like, at what point was it looking impossible for these guys? What could they have done? I mean, that's what sort of I'm seeing. It's like they literally were limited by their lack of carriers, and they just could not get those aircraft out there to contend with the British air superiority. I think that was their weakness. So even if they had tried to get more infantry onto the island, they probably would have been intercepted before they got there. So I think it was calculated, withdrawal, from what I could tell.
They could have just, put a lot more infantry on the island before the British even got there.
Well,
right.
But that was looking backwards. They didn't anticipate the success, I guess, of the British.
Yeah, that's what's most curious is why, when they invaded, why not bring on 20,000 guys or 30,000 Argentine conscripts and just
they
keep them on
underestimated
the
the
island?
British. resolve.
Well, I think another thing is that their carrier battle group, which they had, was going to be like a pincher movement against the British task force, but they called them off because of the Belgrano incident. So maybe they didn't anticipate that being, and maybe it was good that they called it off because there was a British submarine stalking that group, which had orders to fire on it if it got close enough. So maybe it was smart for them to do it. Maybe it was dumb.
I mean, what Hank was saying is that once you have a catastrophe, they sort of lose legitimacy from a military regime standpoint. What's his name? Leopoldo Galtieri. He resigned as soon as the war was over. Like his political career was done, and he was replaced immediately by another member of the junta. But the junta didn't last for very long after they lost this war. Like they only lasted, I believe, another year.
That's the wrinkle. So you get into minor defeat, and you're like, okay, we can just kind of try to pin this whole thing on the guy whose bright idea it was.
Mm-hmm.
But bigger disasters presumably take down more people. I could see that as being a internal dynamic.
Right. And you had, like, at one point towards the end of this, once the British had advanced onto some of the mountains and had taken over some of the key mountain positions, or moving on, taking down Stanley, there was an attempt by, I think, Panama and Spain and some others in the UN to issue a ceasefire and to give cover to the Argentines, presumably for some kind of military maneuver. And the British used their powers, or their veto powers, and removed that I don't know what you would call it in UN terms, but that legislation or that proposal, and then continued advancing deeper into the Falklands. And they were essentially at that point committed to capturing and defeating all of the Argentine military on the island.
And the other thing is that the British have nuclear weapons, and that's what's interesting to me about the whole thing, is that it's an example of what nuclear weapons will and will not give you if you're a country.
Right.
So they, if they had wanted to, they could have just nuked Buenos Aires, and that would have sort of settled the war probably, but they didn't do that. So I don't know. I mean, I think that at a certain point, the Argentinians probably don't want to be fighting a nuclear power, even if there isn't an imminent risk of them actually using the weapons. It's just not something that's maybe sensible to do.
Yeah, and I think they could also see the conventional forces of the British allies willing to back them up if they were in trouble. I just don't think the Argentinians had a chance after the initial attempt failed, and I think they saw that and they realized that.
Yeah, I mean, by the point that Bluff Cove is going on, like, and then a couple days after that, when the mountains are claimed by the British, at that point, about a third of the Argentine Air Force had been taken down, and other planes were out for repair. Other planes weren't really usable, so they were very disabled at that point. And the writing was on the wall. But I don't think that nuking Buenos Aires was ever in the cards. There's no way Reagan would have ever
allowed
that to happen.
I'm not saying it was.
Oh, okay.
I'm just saying if you're fighting somebody who can do that to you, it's just not a comfortable position to be in.
Right.
It's like fighting.
It is interesting, like, when will the nuclear deterrent ever be used? It's never been used, ever. I mean, it's been used as sort of a surprise, but it was never actually used in defense. And so the question is interesting to me when those get deployed. And there are sort of agreements that the superpowers had during the Cold War, things like, will not launch on first strike, which actually happened during Clinton, but it was like, will launch on first strike. So that basically means if we see your missiles in flight, we will then release. But the U.S. position was we will never openly engage. And then the Clintons changed that to...
That was the Soviet position as well, was no first strike.
Right, and then the Clintons changed it to we will only launch after impact, which is stupid, but, but you can look that one over yourself. So yeah, I mean, I don't think, well, there were actually, I guess in Vietnam and Korea, there were discussions about using them offensively. But I think at that point you have a real hot war, and I don't think the Falklands ever escalated above kind of a brush fire scale. And so I think it would have to go to the mainland first. But the British have no claims over that area, so it would have to get really big, basically, is what I would expect.
I think if they had started executing British Falklanders and mistreating them or anything like that, there were mass firing lines, there's some kind of rape of Nanking style treatment, maybe the tenor would have been a lot different. But from what I can tell, the Argentines were mostly set on the idea of we don't really want to incur too much wrath, so we're just going to grab these people and then ship them back to the UK, and that's going to be that.
Yeah, the gamble was if we can just stun the world, capture it, and then not face any sort of retaliation, then we won. But in the event that the British pulled the full weight of their military and their allies, I don't think they ever thought that was even going to happen, or at least they thought it was a low chance. So I think in that case, yeah, they decided to, and I think they correctly decided not to escalate.
Well, they didn't. It wasn't just them. I mean, and PT can back me up on this. It was, what was her name? Jean Kirkpatrick, who's the UN.
Yeah, she was the ambassador to the UN.
Yeah, Reagan's UN gal. She basically had the same contention. Like they were a lot of people inside the United States NatSec establishment were baffled that the British actually committed to a war. They were very stunned, and there were groups of them in particular who were almost pro Argentina and wanted a better relationship with Argentina.
There was a relationship with the CIA in Argentina because of that. That location was used as a training grounds for the Contras, which were from Nicaragua, and they were actually clandestinely moved down there so that the Soviets or whoever has eyes on that area of the world wouldn't notice it. So it was actually somewhat distant from the actual combat zone. And so the military government in the Argentinian areas, they thought that foolishly that the CIA actually represented the U.S. government. And so they thought that sort of, quid pro quo would be returned to them in the event that they went to war over the Falklands, which is the British territory. And they miscalculated that one. Like many other governments have, they have relationships with these clandestine services from the CIA and other agencies, I'm sure. And
didn't a similar thing happen with Saddam?
Of course, yeah.
So you really could, underline this point. Like the CIA made a deal with Argentina, and Argentina thought that meant the entire U.S. state was behind them, and then acted accordingly. That's really like quite a thing, and it turned out that no, actually, the U.S. is not behind you. It's just the CIA likes you more than the State Department does.
Even outside of the intelligence services of the United States, the U.S. government as a whole, especially after the Cold War, has developed a really poor reputation for reliability. This is the sort of position that Russia finds itself in that it will make a sort of deal with the United States after the Warsaw Pact falls apart and the H.W. Bush administration promises not to extend NATO into it. And then they grabbed Poland and they were about to grab Ukraine, and that's when the sort of conflict opened up. And the Obama administration dispatched Hillary Clinton actually out to Moscow to meet, I guess it was Sergei Lavrov. And I've remembered this since the news cameras caught this because I thought it was so embarrassing. But she brought a button, the reset button, this big comical red button that was supposed to be sort of a peaceful negotiation or a peaceful opening of the relationship between Russia and the United States, because it was Medvedev that had sort of taken the position from Putin temporarily so he can come back later, of course. And the button said reset to the Americans, but I think they'd used Google Translate because Lavrov actually corrected her on camera and said, actually, that says this. That's not the wrong word. And I'm like, oh my God,
it meant
this is so embarrassing.
Overcharged. Which, this is like when some clownish figure like Hillary Clinton comes in and presents you with a giant toy button that says overcharged. What kind of a clown world situation is this?
Why didn't they have a Russian speaker on hand to look at this?
They don't care.
Dude, the State Department is just full of strivers to get to other positions in government.
They do have Russian
Jews
speakers.
and have
I'm guessing that what happened was, like, the day before, she screams at some intern that we need a novelty button. And the intern stays up all night trying to procure, like, giant industrial button. And then doesn't have enough time to actually get through the phone tree to, like, talk to
Was this intern murdered later?
Plausibly.
So back to the final date, June 11th, we have the last major loss of the war, and that is the HMS Glamorgan, which isn't sunken, but it's essentially taken out of commission pretty badly. You have a couple deaths. This is also the second major exocet strike on a destroyer. The weird thing is that this actually exploded, but it smacked into the ship at a weird angle and like skidded alongside it and exploded. It didn't actually penetrate and explode the way it was designed to. There was some weird physics, the way it was turning, the way it was hit, that prevented of like a full scale destruction of the ship.
The exoset, which was jerry-rigged and ripped off of an Argentine destroyer and set up as a land-based battery. This fact, which I mentioned earlier, and that was, as you said, like pretty much, I think it was the last major loss of life in the whole war.
Yeah, like this incident was really, I mean, the incident with the Sheffield and the Glamorgan are both, I mean, I don't know, pure miracles for the British, I think, that they didn't explode the way that they were designed to. In the case of the Sheffield, again, it penetrated all the way into the engine hull. As PT said, the kinetic energy of that ripped the ship apart. There were fires all over the place inside the ship, but it didn't explode the way it was designed to. If it reached that far in and then exploded, pretty much everyone on that ship would have died instantly. And then people who didn't die instantly would have been burned to death or severely scarred, would have drowned. It would have been maybe a complete turnaround on the war effort. Thatcher could have very well had to have resigned if it had gone the way it was supposed to. And same with the Glamorgan. Even though the British were essentially on their way to victory, they got a concession out of the Argentine general 3 days after that. If this had exploded the way it was intended to, if it penetrated and exploded, everyone on this ship probably would have died. But instead, only a few people died, and a couple dozen were injured.
Right? Oh yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with those bombs.
Yeah.
Basically, if they would have exploded instead of just crashing into the ship and caused fires, you would have had massive casualties, because like lots of British ships were hit. Like their defenses were found to be completely porous.
Yeah.
Is that their air defenses were completely inadequate. At least like their best air defenses were the Harriers. Their Sea Darts and their Sea Wolf missiles, like supposedly more advanced missiles which are supposed to be able to take out exocets and supposed to be able to take out low-fine aircraft, didn't really perform as well as they were supposed to.
Do you know why that is? Was it a targeting issue? Was it lack of speed?
It's just hard to hit something that's moving fast like that.
Interesting thing about the Sea Wolf, I'm gonna put my nerd glasses on here, is that so basically the two main air defenses they had besides guns were the Sea Dart, which was for aim at medium altitudes, so kind of like it was designed for the Warsaw Pact essentially. And they were expecting planes coming in at medium altitude. But the Argentines had the sea dart themselves, and they knew its weaknesses, so they had all of their fly at, like 100 feet off the deck, and that's why they were able to get past them. And the Sea Wolf, on the other hand, was a more advanced system, which was designed to take out missiles, and was also designed to take out low-flying planes, essentially, right? But what happened was that only a few of the British ships had the system on it. The Argentines were actually able to defeat it because after the Sheffield was hit, the British started tagging, didn't have it, with frigates who did have the Seawolf system, theorizing that one would be able to cover for the other, right? But what happened was, it was pretty interesting. I think it was the Coventry and another one which was hit by A4s coming in low. Again, like the fact they're able to do this is amazing to me. Coming in low very fast, and what they did was they fooled the radars by flying very close together. So basically, the radar couldn't one plane. It thought it was one gigantic plane, and so it wasn't able to latch onto it. And so that's how they were able to kind of fool it into not being able to latch onto to the A4s flying in low. And that's something that you don't really learn about your radars until it's probably actually put in to service against a real opponent.
Right. Did the British intelligence realize that the Argentines had access to a lot of this technology? Did they realize that the Argentines had the sea dart?
I would imagine they would know these things.
They had to have known it.
I mean, they also sold a lot of the equipment to the Argentinians, and that surely means that they've got people on the ground, and I'm sure some of those are agents for the Royal Intelligence Services. So that's one of the main things intelligence services will do, is that they'll catalog sort of force strengths of adversaries. So I would imagine that's a high priority for them.
This whole thing just comes across as a huge intelligence failure, not realizing that your main countermeasure is something that your adversary also has and is probably reverse engineered by this point. I don't know.
It doesn't necessarily mean it's intelligence failure. It just means that, are you able to develop a countermeasure? I mean, anti-missile systems are incredibly hard to engineer. I mean, they don't even really work that well today. So even if you knew that, what are you left with? I mean, I don't know how you stop a missile. It's really small. It goes really fast. Short of having one of those like anime like energy bubbles that you blow outside of your ship, I don't know how you block something like that, because you can't really
need a lot of ships. You need a lot of ships, and they didn't have a lot of ships because they hadn't been investing in their navy to the point where they would be able to credibly deliver a counterstroke in the event that someone took one of their colonial possessions.
The best technical solution that exists is basically have a bunch of chain guns surrounding your ship,
and
you try
system?
to just
that's what American carriers
the phalanx, and you just put out a wall of lead.
Right,
but that's not really efficient because you run out of bullets probably before they run out of their missile swarms.
Right.
So I think the phalanx was actually developed right after this in response, because this war was obviously of huge interest to everybody, because as I was saying before, it was the first time these weapons really saw the light of day in a real it was kind of a scrimmage, I guess, is the best way to explain it. And the only time they'd ever really seen actual combat against actual adversaries. And the phalanx system, which, as you were saying, is the chain gun, which is one of the main defenses against missiles that the U.S. has, was developed after they saw what happened.
Yeah, I can imagine that this whole incident probably spooked the American Navy. Just seeing in what you would probably consider to be one of your, I don't know, not colleagues, but equals in terms of naval prowess historically, be taken down so rapidly, ship after ship after ship, in the space of a few months. I'm sure that eventually after that they had to rethink the carrier strike group defense package, which is what you have now. Like every carrier strike group of the United States, I think, has this system in place where they surround that surround the aircraft carrier, and everyone has some kind of chain gun system.
After effects, if we want to move on, I think we're probably ready to move on to the after effects of the war. That was one of the main ones. I mean, is that you have this, the U.S. has a super, basically, like I think each carrier has 10 ships around it.
Something
I think
like that,
yeah, most of, like, and including the submarines, like they're obsessed with keeping people away from the carrier because that's the golden egg there. And thing is that, again, like, we really don't know how these systems work or if they even work at all, because they've never seen combat against ironically, one of in 1987, speaking of the Exocet's greatest hits, I don't know if you guys remember this, but in 1987, a few years after this, the USS Stark in the Persian Gulf was hit by an Iraqi Exocet, not during the Gulf War, but during the Tanker War. I believe it misidentified it as an Iranian ship, and it ended up hitting it and getting through any of its defenses that it had, which is interesting. But
I had totally forgotten about that. What was the U.S. response to that?
But yeah, like, basically it changed how people looked at defense. But again, we really don't know how these systems work. I mean, does the Aegis system work? Anti-missile can shoot down anything theoretically. Nobody really knows.
Yeah.
The best test would be to, I don't know, stage an actual small conflict where you have.
They war game this, but it's tricky because to make it real, you got to lose a ship potentially.
Yeah,
war game stuff like this, because does your missile defense system really work, and does it work against one missile? Does it work against several missiles? Does it work against air attacks and missiles? And there's so many different potentialities that could happen.
Yeah.
Well, the sort of importance of the naval military component is an open question, because China doesn't really have one other than sort of near shore capabilities, and it seems to be doing just fine. And the United States has one, and it doesn't seem to be doing so fine. So I think it's debatable as to whether it's even worth trying to maintain these enormous fleets.
Yeah, especially as with the advance of anti-ship technology. And like, that's what's interesting about the Falklands. It is kind of like a tiny microcosm of what a war against China could look like in a common scenario of, like them invading Taiwan, for instance, which would be this version of this, which would be the mouse, essentially. It would be incomparable in some ways, but in some ways it's kind of similar. It's one power going.
Yeah, well, let's take Taiwan. I mean, this is exactly the parallel. I mean, the United States has to go in and sort of defend this little island that's right off the coast of the mainland of China. And I don't know. I mean, the funny thing is the U.S. Navy actually projected that the British would not be able to win against the Argentinians. And so if they're saying that, about the British against the Argentinians, what the hell are they saying about the Chinese? So that's not a good sign.
But they're so much stronger, and they've been training for this, and they're anti-ship.
Oh, that's my point. I think it's even worse for the Americans to go in there.
A bad day, because if you lose one big ship, that's a huge psychological blow.
No, United States is it's a bit of a paper tiger. I mean, it's more and more showing itself as that with its further entrenchment in the Middle East.
More likely it would be Iran. Iran would blow up a carrier, and then the Chinese would see, oh wow, even Iran can blow up a carrier. Let's make a run for Taiwan.
That's actually another interesting scenario, because the China one is almost too high risk and too much of a real superpower conflict, I think, for the U.S. to actually send carriers into that. But I think that they might send them into the Persian Gulf and not into that tiny little strip of water, and they might have a bad day against the Iranian anti-ship missiles.
Or Hezbollah. Hezbollah has, I think that they hit an Israeli ship of some sort in the last war. What was it? The 2006 war. And they have much, much better capabilities now. And granted, that's not that.
I don't know how advanced Hezbollah's anti-ship missiles are, especially to hit a U.S. one. But in the context of the Persian Gulf, it's a very real possibility for the U.S. Navy.
The
in
Iranian,
the Mediterranean, I mean, around Cyprus, perhaps they could be at risk. Maybe that's an area where the U.S. Navy.
Well, and don't forget the USS Liberty. Israel's always got a ship ready to go.
Yes, exactly. So you have all these states that might blow you up if you have ships going around Cyprus.
I think the Iranian strategy was to overwhelm a carrier group with speedboats and essentially not detach, but deploy anti-armor rounds and anti-armor munitions from speedboats going at high speeds, and that would essentially.
I just love the pluckiness of that. They just look at
essentially. I mean, all of this,
a bunch of boats out.
Yeah, all of this flies below radar. All this flies maybe 20 feet above the waves. There's no way the Aegis system is gonna pick out a bunch of RPGs heading.
Well, the
right
USS Cole was hit by supposedly Al Qaeda, right, with one of those back in. God, what was that?
Oh, yeah.
2000? 99?
Yeah.
I can't remember, but yeah, around
there. Yeah, that was 99. I remember being angry back then about why we wouldn't go after quotation marks, bin Laden.
Yeah. Well, he hadn't done his final act yet.
CIA agent Osama bin Laden. But yeah,
that's not
I
even
think,
controversial. He was.
Yeah, I think that the major difference between an Argentine counter-assault and a potential Iranian counter-assault is that the Iranians would not utilize their air force as much. I don't think the Iranians want to test the American anti-aircraft batteries or the anti-aircraft countermeasures, but testing the Aegis system and testing it from some kind of distributed assault below radar would probably be a lot more effective for them.
I mean, also you have to remember is a lot of the Iranian anti-ship missiles are shore launched.
Mm-hmm.
They're not like exocet launched from super Antendards, essentially. Like they're all in because like Iranians control these islands in the Persian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf is tiny. It's a little. It's like a canal almost.
And things like an F-22 Raptors are incredibly dangerous to any sort of bombing aircraft. So I think that they would avoid attempting to launch any kind of air war with the United States, would opt for something more distributed.
Well, bombers are used against land targets, so the United States would basically be doing carrier operations. I guess you would have to invade.
Use bombers theoretically against carriers.
Officially, Iran doesn't have much of an air force. Officially, at least.
Well, they got Air Force. We sold them a bunch of F-14s.
F-14.
Yeah, how long ago was that, though? Those are not modern
70s.
aircraft.
It was before. It was during the Shah. So whenever that
those
happened.
are not modern aircraft.
Yeah.
So, what are the other major conclusions we can strip from this small little conflict?
And it's not just that the A4 is the most underrated plane in aviation history. It's that interesting because it was the beginning of our modern, 1990 splendid little wars that the West waged. It was really the first one because after this happened, Margaret Thatcher became a hero. The British populace went from downbeat, like almost like still kind of the 70s to this victorious. They still have their mojo. Even though it's all bullshit. It's kind of like your sports team winning and how your hometown is after that happens. When they win the Super Bowl, it's like everybody changes, even though nothing has changed.
After 9/11, Bush went from like a 30% approval rating to a 75% approval rating. So it really is.
And there was right around the time of the Falklands War, there was a certain politician in England who was watching all this happen. You know who that was?
Tony Blair?
John Major?
Tony Blair. He was watching all this happen. I think he was running for his first seat, maybe. And he saw what it did for Thatcher. And then, that's when England decided to become a lot more involved in adventures with the Americans in the Gulf War, which was another splendid little war. In Serbia in the 90s, which was another splendid little war. So you have like 2 or 3 wars, which boost morale for the people, and they love it because they're not very low casualties. The Gulf War would be, I think, the Falklands probably the highest casualties for the British. Afghanistan or Iraq or 2003 Iraq, I think. Space of years, but so basically, it really west to go after these little perfect winnable wars, to go after the Argentinas and the Serbias and the Iraqs of the world, or glory and self-affirmation, essentially.